everyone. My name is Natasha Muhoza, and I welcome you so warmly to our next episode of It With Muhoza. Now, It With Muhoza is a show that has been going on for a while on Instagram Live. Today, though, is different. It's bright and beautiful, and we are very, very kindly hosted at the amazing Coffee and Bagels in Kilimani, Nairobi, which is just makes my heart so happy because finally we are evolving into a beautiful space of creativity with this show. And so I invite you on this journey with me. This show really aims to tell the story of Africans, young people from across the continent, sharing knowledge, sharing all kinds of information, fun, educational, decentralizing how we share that knowledge. We've had all sorts of amazing people in the creative arts, in fashion, in sports, and today we have the amazing honor of being joined by what some may call an architect, but what he calls an interdisciplinary designer. He is none other than Mr. Balmoi Abe. Welcome to the show, my brother.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you.
And so let's get right into it. Could you please help us define interdisciplinary design as it relates to African life within the spaces they inhabit?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Also to be, I think, one of the first guests who are not live.
Yes.
So this allows us to get all my itches out the way. But no, thank you once again for this long-awaited opportunity to be on your show. What is an interdisciplinary designer? Well, there's a formality in that definition that I think gets lost in African translation.
Yeah.
What's very interesting is that Africans found themselves in probably the last 2 years heavily faced by, and I'll say 200 years, heavily faced by forces that were external. That being, the sort of the transversing and discovery or rediscovery of the continent by different groups of people. Africans come from a system of knowledge-based understanding. This is something that is easily passed down through generations. And I find that, we have sort of found ourselves in this cultural entanglement of a readoption that finds itself intertwined around a belief system rather than a knowledge-based system, which is a very different approach to thinking and execution. Yeah, and just sort of to break that down even further, interdisciplinary allows you to capture a variety of nuances.
Right.
For instance, the African culture, the way we hunt, the way we cook, the way we gather and commune are all interconnected. These are not silo approaches to engagement. So I feel that, also physically and mentally as a professional, addressing the interdisciplinary approach begins to bring leverage to, better understanding, the interconnectivity of things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I just like how every time we have conversations, and we have had many, you take me down this path of curiosity about the spaces that we inhabit,
Right.
how they relate to our cultures. And so that leads me very well into my next question, which is, how does this translate into the preservation, the understanding of our histories as African people?
Ooh. I would have to say, what's very interesting is the interconnectivity we have once again to identity. You've got to look at, even as far as the lovely outfit that you're wearing, where that resonates from, sort of the heritage aspect of identifying yourself with product, identifying yourself with customary and tradition. These are heavy embedded within the African makeup. And I find that as a preservation, as a point of discussion, leads itself into a new narrative. We say this because there's an adoption of technology that also equally is embedded within the culture. So when you speak of preservation, I think there needs to be a preservation within the transition. And I feel that sort of leverages once again a sort of a renaissance of a new beginning.
Right.
Yeah. And that, once again, redefines space in a way that is very conducive to not only just the user, but the energies that are represented within the space. And that can get into the discussion of building materials. It can get into the discussion of how we relate from indoor and outdoor spaces. What are the transitions as thresholds? So I feel that there's still a language that is heavily shared and embedded in culture.
Yes.
And the discussion of preservation is maybe a very formalized label given to something that is just a very localized practice.
Yes, which has been around for centuries.
Absolutely.
Really.
Absolutely.
And you touch on a thing about how the built spaces right now really translate a lot into our cultures, into our identifying with them and how that comes about. But you would agree with me that some of the existing, especially for many African urban spaces, urban cities, some of these structures that have been in place for a while since colonial times really don't necessarily address some of the needs of African communities.
Yes.
And so how do you reconcile, or how does interdisciplinary design, which is sort of what you put your heart and mind into, how do you address these issues that are have not been addressed? Yeah.
I feel that the loss of identity, or sort of this discussion that you've really touched on, that's pretty important here, is heavily embedded in sort of the, if I can be very explicit here, it's the explicit side of brainwashing. There's a side to this that translates to the way you dress, the way the way you sleep, the way you label the spaces that you live in, versus an apartment and a house, the thresholds you enter from a living to a kitchen to a bedroom. You take that back to context of an African family or an African heritage, in the sense of what does settlement begin to look like. The nuance of space is heavily embedded in community engagement. And I feel that is part and parcel of the way people interact, is heavily translated into their personal identities and customs. So case in point, a kingdom, an African tribe, which is sort of a relabel. A kingdom sits on its own and is well defined by principles and values. That in itself leverages sort of the sustainability amongst the people who dwell inside this kingdom or follow a set of rules. What you find now is sort of the raping of a landscape with the formality of colonial structures that have a different energy source and a different composition. I say a different composition because it does not relate directly to the kingdoms, which are cities within themselves, not just formalized cities the way we find cities of today, but these were cities within their constructs or contexts that followed a set of guidelines and principles, as I mentioned. But when you find yourself adopting not only a change in language, a change in names, I mean, we know you as Natasha, it really starts to play on the psyche. And the change that sort of begins to develop is also exuded in behavior. You begin to see a change in behavior, which also then influences one's culture. But then there's also another entanglement within that that leads to say, is there an adoption or is there a lack of an adaptation? And if so, what are the margins of indifference? And I feel that also has become a conflict within the African narrative, especially around gender roles. And I feel that that's something that equally leads into more of the advantageous tools that colonialism has spread across the continent in terms of what colonialism is receiving versus what we are doing to build on the retelling of a narrative of our personal identity. Because I feel that there's a lack of mentorship and a lack of bridging sort of the sustainability models that we've always practiced within the African fabric.
Yeah.
And that starts with community.
So how do you undo that process? Because I get the sense that you're also speaking of subtly a losing of ourselves from some of the structures and some of the ways in which our spaces have been, designed or were made and left for us to inherit post-colonial days. So how do we maximize our ability to reimagine our spaces, go back to draw from that African heritage?
Well, I don't know as to whether there is a very clear roadmap, if there's a very clear roadmap to reinventing sort of what was lost and what has been adopted. I feel it's more importantly to understand what once was and how that has sort of pivoted and shifted the sort of the cultural norms that we find ourselves wrapped up in today. It is also very indicative to think about technology as a one-way street. And I feel that also when you think about time versus history, that too has a connotation around being that one-way street. So to try to have that conflict, to change the tide and the momentum at which you find yourself kind of being influenced, I think leads yourself to sort of this self-destruction approach. So what I would like to say is it needs to be addressed that there could be re-engagements of narratives that have sort of addressed soft power of ignorance. You can see where the subtleties of influence from systems brought by external forces through administration need to be readdressed. I even feel that some of the storytelling about the honesty of what has happened in the past will begin to leverage and build sort of the horizons of the young African people. And I feel that that in itself begins to give credence to things such as the Sphinx, the Sphinx in Egypt. The first thing I would begin to ask, it's something I think I bring up quite a lot. Return the nose and the mouth back to the Sphinx. Something simple as that puts in context what you have just began to ask me. How do you rebuild? How do you restructure? How do you retell a story? And sometimes it's only about revealing what has been hidden.
Right. So it all comes down really to drawing from the roots, going back to the drawing board in very simple terms. And this reminds me of something I came across a video that you were part of with another group of architects. You mentioned a lot about vernacular architecture. What does this mean? Why is it so important to draw back? Because you were speaking about it from a point of view of returning or drawing from the histories, our histories,
right.
Drawing our sense of design, or drawing that from what is really most authentic to us. If you can maybe clarify that better.
Yes, what's very interesting about your question, you spoke about indigenous and vernacular. You've got to understand that the word vernacular, or even putting into context indigenous, is sort of a labeling or a re-identifying with a subject that fits a certain parameter or boundary. Vernacular is really a way to draw from the context in which you find resources. So if you want to build a space, you find that by finding that the building materials are readily available around you. Yes. What can you put together with those materials? And if so, could you manage and minimize the extraction of the more natural materials from the ground in a means that is sustainable for generations, and more importantly for the land in which you find yourself dwelling on? The vernacular of that is not just identifying yourself with African huts.
Yes.
the context is the building directory, the building materials that are drawn from the African hut. What you find today that is labeled colonial is the composition of the palette. So an African hut usually has a circular form. Colonial structures are usually rectangular. But please note, the heritage of also those rectangular buildings are vested in Kemet. You know, the origins of that comes from the Kemet and ancient Nubia. But what's equally important, once again, vernacularism in its purest form is everything around the circular economy. It is everything that the SDGs look to strive to achieve. You can also put into context that it is the closest thing to a net zero effect that we can actually adopt. So vernacular in context, and please, colonial buildings used local materials.
Yes.
I mean, here in Nairobi, we look at the Thika stone, which we still build with today. We built with the Thika stone, which is an extraction from the earth. It is just that the way the stone begins to be manipulated and crafted and groomed defines a level of energy that is repurposed to fit a certain aesthetic. So I think what you begin to start asking yourself is, we're already in a position where we're speaking a certain language, we dress a certain way, you know, we identify with one another very differently from our great-grandparents.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at my great-grandparents and I don't even think they know what Kenya and Uganda was or ever would have been. Because they were not alive in a time like that to understand the formal administration of independence. So they don't, you know, 4 generations away, we're far removed from saying we're Kenyans or Ugandans.
That is true.
So you put that in context, other things such as vernacularism hold weight far further than sort of the administration of legal appropriation that comes with such things.